Tanah, thank you very much indeed for joining me today, and congratulations on this new report.
Thanks very much, Taimur. I'm very, very happy to be here with you.
The report itself is detailed, it's structured, it's well thought through, it has a lot of really careful consideration and analysis in it, which I think is fantastic for a company like Gojek. And I want to talk to you, if I could, about how this came about, how you got there, and most significantly of all, what others can learn from this. Because the journey towards creating an ESG policy and integrating it into your business process, I think is something that a lot of companies in Indonesia are going to have to address, and indeed all around Asia. So your experience here would be fantastic. So a good place to begin is, tell me how this all came about in the first place.
So I think first off, for background, that's really, really relevant here, is that a lot of the things that we talk about in the report are the culmination of several years of work and efforts and priorities setting from different parts of Gojek as a company. It isn't like for the first time we are now considering environmental social issues as critical to our company, but these have been the outputs of several years of work, as mentioned. And so this report really is retrospective in the sense that it's looking back at the impact of some of these initiatives. That said, in October 2020, we set up the sustainability function, and this is when I joined Gojek. And I think the intention or the primary mandate I had in the beginning was really to pull together all of these initiatives and efforts and really put a systematic and strategic approach to it. So these weren't just ad hoc, siloed efforts, but rather very, very intentional from the company standpoint.
But was the impetus your arrival? Was the impetus a deep desire within the existing management to do something? Was it an imperative from the government that prompted this path in the first place? How did it all come about?
It really started from the very top. And so the co-CEOs themselves, as I mentioned, have been kind of leading different efforts across the group. And I had been in conversation with Gojek leadership for several years, not specifically about this job, but rather about how Gojek as a company could contribute to shaping the agenda of a country like Indonesia on the global stage. So at events, at international and global platforms like Davos or others, how can a company like Gojek contribute to the conversations that are taking place, related even more so to Indonesia, because there was so much outside interest on Indonesia specifically. And of course, when you're looking at the business landscape, Gojek stands out for lots and lots of reasons. And so I think having been working with the Gojek leadership for several years, it kind of was all everything in the universe lining up. I think it was, right. The company was ready because it's a lot. You need to make sure you have the right appetite across all the leadership, and there is buy-in and real understanding of why we're doing this and what it's going to mean if and when we go down this path. And that was just universal across all of the Gojek leadership team. And so that was kind of all the stars aligning and with my...
As you say, it's for Indonesia as a nation to go down this path is absolutely imperative. Where is the nation overall in this? And how much has the government put pressure on companies like Gojek to begin to think along these lines? Or are you leading the broader political thinking by doing this yourself?
I'm not going to go out there and say we're leading. If others want to say that we are leading, that's great. Not to toot our own horn, but we've taken extremely kind of difficult decisions and made huge investments in this space because we are actually transforming the way we do business. That said, this is all for us a pre-competitive space. And so what we can share based on our experience, and likewise what we can learn from others' experiences as well, or insights and best practices, we are absolutely open to and really keen to do so. However, as you rightly pointed out, this is still, in a country like Indonesia, it's still very much in its early stages, which means that when we were embarking on this journey 8 months ago, we didn't necessarily have a clear playbook to follow, i.e., what does best practice look like for this industry, for this type of company in this market?
And that's exactly why I was really interested in talking to you, because you know, for you, you came upon a blank slate that you had to fill in, and I'm thinking that throughout the rest of Indonesia, every other company is facing exactly that blank slate, and the question they're going to be asking themselves is, what can we do about it? We're not even Gojek. We don't have that kind of resource capacity to be able to follow that path. But I was really interested to read in the co-CEO statement. They said, we want to share not only our successes, but also our lessons learned and areas where we need to work with similarly committed and mission-driven partners. And so what I principally wanted to ask you was, how can you do that? You know, what can you do to help those folks? I mean, where should they begin? If they were to come to you and say, Tanah, we haven't got the first clue. What is this process of becoming ESG compliant all about?
Start yesterday. We should have started yesterday. First is get to know the stakeholders that you are going to be accountable to. Two, even if you start with just one environmental or social issue, look at that in context of the business that you have and say, what would my business look like if I was properly responding to and preparing my business for this as a real risk, the same way I would for financial risks. Three, yeah, it requires a little bit of reading, but there is the GRI and the SASB standards. The websites have a lot of great information that is publicly available to use, along with corresponding guidelines and frameworks and so forth that you can download specific to industries. And then four, understand what you are comfortable to disclose and have that discussion within your company, because from the moment you start reporting on these issues and your performance related to these issues, you have set yourself your bare minimum benchmark, which means that every year you are at a bare minimum going to have to report and disclose on those issues.
You've identified stakeholders, obviously that's what it's all about, but what about the shareholders? Because a lot of companies are still going to come to this conversation with that mindset which says, our duty is to be profitable. How much damage are we going to do to that duty and that bottom line by considering this path? So how did you address that question?
It's a great point. One is always turning it a little bit on its head and saying, this is not a cost to our company. This is an investment in the future of our platform. And I think the investors that we have worked with so far, I mean, we have several global investors who themselves has ESG specific teams and ESG specific screening and checklists and periodic assessments that I think are quite substantial and demonstrates that investors themselves are moving slowly, or in some cases quite rapidly, towards better ESG benchmarks for their companies that they're investing in. So I think we took a lot from those investors that we have who have proactively reached out or are engaging with us on a regular, consistent basis to understand what our ESG performance and metrics are.
Okay, and the second part of the question was, you talked about all these extensive conversations you had with other stakeholders, that whole materiality conversation that you've been holding. Again, a lot of companies are going to say, listen, we simply don't have the resources to do that. What do you say to those folks who are starting from a much lower base from you? What are the key components that they can begin with?
Well, I think, look, you have to also weight different stakeholder groups, right? They're not all going to be weighted the same way. And not everyone has the level of understanding of ESG issues the same way that maybe some leadership in Gojek had. But all that to say, I mean, having just an assessment of, okay, where are we at when we think about environmental and social issues as they relate to the impact on our company as a business? What environmental and social issues currently or could pose a risk to our company and actually have financial implications if we do not address them. Now, maybe that's already a little bit one step ahead, but there are some incredibly valuable tools out there that companies can already start using now, and they are free and accessible and public.
Name some. Give me just a quick example.
Yeah, absolutely. So we took, so for those who have read the report, we have disclosed key indicators as they relate to the Global Reporting Initiative standards. And we also aggregated standards from the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB. So both GRI and SASB are free kind of standards that are provided for companies as a guidance to use when they want, or if and when they are ready to report on their sustainability kind of performance.
Tell me about the ultimate decision to use those two particular metrics or bodies, because there are plenty of others. Are those specifically relevant to your business, or do you think they're applicable across the board?
I mean, our business is a little bit of, it's kind of a hodgepodge, right? It's not like we have a traditional anchor industry like financial services or like, even transportation or oil and gas or banking or whatever it is. So we are kind of an aggregate of all these different industries. So we couldn't even take the industry specific standards, as black and white as they were, we couldn't just take them off the shelf and apply them to our company. And so that's where I think engaging these types of bodies, we had a very close collaboration with GRI. The reason we use GRI is, and I can't remember the statistic now, but I think it's over 75% of Fortune 500 caliber companies use GRI standards. Now, GRI standards are complementary also to SASB standards. They are not competing or overlapping. They're complementary because GRI standards speak to a broad set of stakeholders, which in our case was a way for us to communicate our ESG performance to our users, to the general public, to policymakers, and to others.
Okay.
SASB, though, is specific to investors. I mean, these were created to communicate the financial materiality of ESG issues to companies in specific industries.
The way you're framing your particular context is obviously absolutely applicable to your business, but your peer group, as you're putting it, are the Fortune 500 companies. What about those other companies in Indonesia who don't see that as their peer group? Are there differing or maybe even more locally based structures and institutions and standards that they might look to?
So the standards, both GRI, SASB, and even others, they are not industry or market specific, which means that if I'm a manufacturing company or an oil and gas company, no matter how small or large I am or where I am based, I can apply GRI or SASB standards, because when you're on, anyone can take a look on their site, and there's, guidelines and all kinds of supplementary material to help guide companies through this journey, as well as they're available also for engaging if you have specific questions that aren't available on the website. But essentially, it's a matter of drilling down to what are the environmental and social issues most relevant to my company. And that, I think most companies will have an inkling of, right? And so if you're in, if you're a small F&B company, right, there's issues around, you could say there's issues around your supply chain or around your packaging, and these are very, very prominent even right now in mainstream media. A lot of conversations are being had about it. So you can already take those and say, okay, well, what does GRI say as it relates to packaging use and disposal? Oh, I can see it online, and here is the 3 key things that GRI wants every company to disclose if packaging use and disposal is applicable and relevant to your company. And in my case, as in the example I provided, it is. So I can go through and say, do I have responses and supporting evidence for each of these 3 key kind of areas that GRI has listed for this indicator.
One of the interesting aspects that apply really to you, to Gojek, probably more than most companies, is that supply chain question that you touched on a moment ago. Because from what your report says, better than 90% of your specific emissions related to your work come from exterior suppliers. They're what they call scope 3 emissions, right? These are people that you have to persuade that are not part of your company that they too need to bring on board the kind of thinking that you're talking about. If you're to achieve your aims, your supply chain has to come on board, doesn't it? How do you begin to address the issue of other companies with whom you do business to do what you're doing?
It always requires a lot of diplomacy, I think, and aligning on just what exactly are the common agenda items or points or objectives that we have as two separate entities. I think if we take the example you provided, Timur, of us, Gojek, the platform company, and the driver partners who are in and of themselves individuals and micro entrepreneurs, they own their own vehicles, which means we cannot force them to, for example, transition or replace their conventional bike with an electric bike. What we can do, though, is ensure that we have the right infrastructure available for them and that we have a response to all of their concerns regarding why they would transition to an electric vehicle. So whether it's around cost, whether it's around range, whether it's around charging infrastructure or swapping infrastructure, we better be sure we have a response to that, and not just that, but we've actually tested out solutions to that and can work with them to make sure that those solutions are actually scalable and sustainable in real life.
Are you saying that Gojek is going to take responsibility for providing, let's say, charging infrastructure for electric vehicles?
We're working, we are always the facilitator as a platform, right? And whether you're talking about EVs or whether you're talking about alternative or sustainable packaging, we are always the facilitator. That said, I think what's been hopefully made clear in the report is that we do take responsibility for that role. And as best as possible, because of the reach and the size that we are, we have the ability to move the entire ecosystem with us. But the idea is, we don't want to force it to happen. But if we, for example, create the right incentives for our merchant partners to shift to sustainable packaging, or we create the right incentives for our driver partners to swap their conventional bikes with electric bikes, and the financial or price modeling that supports that.
Well, you have committed to going fully electric fleet in very short order. So how are you going to persuade your drivers and your merchant partners? Are these who you call your merchant partners? I'm not quite sure what that category covers. But how are you going to persuade those people to swap their combustion engines for electric vehicles according to your timeline?
We're very much still scoping what this blueprint is going to look like. And I think there's a lot of interest in seeing what that plan year on year is going to look like leading up to 2030, because it's less than 10 years from today. And yes, it's a very ambitious goal, but we have always been an ambitious company. Again, going back to the cost element, I think the total cost of ownership is a huge roadblock. We want to get to a point where we can offer electric vehicles, electric bikes that are 30% less than conventional bikes. And we're going to do that by working with the right partners, because we're not an automotive manufacturer. We don't create batteries. Not yet. We don't produce batteries, nor do we provide power. We're not a power grid. So there's, upstream and downstream, there's a lot of players that we need to corral. And I think
sorry to interrupt, but so how are you going to do that? What is your message to those drivers and that broader universe of platform users and your merchant partners? What is your message to them? Because you're going to have to inspire them to get on board, right?
If the climate change argument doesn't inspire enough, then we're in much bigger trouble. No, I think in all honesty, it's a combination of a couple of things. One is, of course, that this is something we have to do because climate-related risk is core to our business. We want to respond to it and manage it accordingly, as we would financial risk. And so you have to be able to communicate that, obviously, to the different stakeholder groups in a currency or in a language that they understand as well.
With that process of messaging, of persuasion, of getting people on board, you've also talked about in this report, you've talked about how you're going to help people doing. You've got a sustainability advisory council you put up. You say you're creating dedicated communities to facilitate the exchange of best practices, knowledges, and tools. Tell me a little bit more about that infrastructure and that process whereby you can really tell and educate others.
So this advisory council for us is really an external, impartial group of experts, practitioners, academics who live and breathe this every day. They've been invited and we've engaged them because of their subject matter expertise on issues like air quality or emissions or packaging and waste, or socioeconomic progress. What we wanted to do by designing this council, they are all voluntary. And they obviously have a lot of credibility in their own right. So for us, it was really about, we have come up with these targets, with these proposed blueprints, which we have not published or disclosed yet, but we want to work with them to make sure that, is it just us that says this is going to work, or is this actually going to stand up to the test of international frameworks, global accreditation bodies? For example, with emissions, there's the Science-Based Targets Initiative. That is a multi-year application process to get verified by them and to submit your targets for year-on-year carbon emission reduction. So that is absolutely our ambition, and that's what we're preparing to do. But we need constructive criticism, because I think if you surround yourself with yes men all the time who have a vested interest in being your yes man or woman, then you're not going to get anywhere particularly meaningful, I think. And so for us, we've had a lot of this constructive dialogue with these experts as a group, as one-on-one, to make sure that we are leaving no stone unturned as it relates to the targets we want to set and the plans that we have in place.
But let me ask you about measurements. So your framework, you've used GRI, SASB. What about measuring the impact? What metrics are you using? What are you prioritizing?
So we have made 3 commitments: 0 emissions, 0 waste, and 0 barriers, what we call the 3 zeros. Now, for each of those commitments, we are looking at metrics, or have already identified metrics that we are going to prioritize as our key kind of indicators of progress every year, and that we will publicly disclose every year here on out our progress on in the sustainability report that we produce. So with emissions, I think it's very black and white. You can take your carbon inventory, you can publish that every year, and you can say, here's how we've reduced our footprint, scope 1, with either direct or indirect emissions. And then here's how, for example, EV adoption has contributed to a 30% reduction in our carbon footprint. I mean, it's very black and white. And those are the kinds of things that a body like the Science-Based Targets Initiative require to be able to be verified, to have your targets verified by them. Waste, very similar approach and line of thinking, where it's, do your accounting of your waste footprint. Where is it coming from? What is it primarily made up of? And that's direct for a platform company like us. It's both our direct and indirect waste produced because of our platform. And then from there, use that data to identify where and how you can reduce or avoid that waste altogether. And then how we can then work with waste processing companies who might have solutions to ensure appropriate disposal of waste. Socioeconomic progress or impact or development, this is a very complex one, and one we are still figuring out, because we definitely know we don't have all the answers. You can look at bodies like the World Bank. They have poverty alleviation reduction teams. are many think tanks and multilateral organizations out there who have done so much research on this, and it can be a very overwhelming space to try and figure out a path forward on. But all that to say, for us, the metrics we are, I think, prioritizing are the ones that are going to tell us the most accurate story of whether or not our platform has a positive impact on the livelihoods of our driver partners first, and then our merchant partners second. And merchant partners, for all your viewers, Timur, the differentiation is merchant partners are those who are the Go Food sellers, for example. So they can be either big franchises like Burger King or McDonald's or Starbucks or what have you, to the micro SMEs who are selling food from, it's a small business essentially, and that those small businesses make up around 96% of our merchant partner base.
Being able to measure and account for how much good you're doing is also a very new science in this context, isn't it? So is there a movement towards understanding what are the applicable metrics in Indonesia in general, not just for Gojek, but as a nation? And are there conversations and groups being built around these considerations where you are?
The private sector engagement or involvement in that discussion is probably not as consistent as it might be in other countries, but there's a reason for that. Now, in Gojek's context specifically, I think we are in what can be considered a relatively new industry. We're a new type of company because we're not a 50-year-old, F&B company or a commodities company or an energy company. So for us, even working with all the stakeholders we have, they're also a little bit learning as they go in terms of what should be the indicators or the criteria that a platform company like Gojek looks at as it relates to our relationship with our driver partners who are in and of themselves entrepreneurs on our platform, and by some definitions, workers as well. Now, these are not employees, but workers. So it's a very, I don't know if it's a new conversation, but it's one that's definitely, there is no kind of universal consensus or best practice as it relates to that yet.
Let me end by asking you one difficult question that always comes up in these contexts. Offsets are part of your agenda. Offsets are part of your process for meeting the targets you have set yourself. The question is, how much are you relying on offsets? And to what extent do you think this is a sustainable approach to the process? Because you're living in a country where the natural environment is degrading rapidly and things need to be done. And yet, if everybody who's promised to offset their carbon footprint by planting a tree, we just don't have enough land to plant new trees. So how are you addressing that particular thorny issue?
And Timur, there's even the question of what kind of tree are you planting, and is that really, the best solution for this? And look, in short, offsetting is not it's not the main part of our strategy with this. I think what we don't want to do is use offsetting or rely on offsetting and then let our business run as usual, because then nothing changes. And so this is where I think those more difficult decisions need to be made and have been made, and at least in our organization's context of, we are 100% behind this commitment. And as a result, it means we have to actually change the way that we are doing business, and not in a way that, we are saying we're changing, but we are actually making some, what I would call wrenching decisions that will have, that we won't see the fruits of that labor until several years down the road. But this is where that cost versus investment perspective can be very, very powerful and beneficial, right? It's, for us, we are making these investments now. We know in year one, we are going to rely on offsetting for sure. But as we get better and better at this, as we adopt more electric vehicles, as we start shifting to renewable energy to power our offices, which, by the way, is still a small percentage of our entire carbon footprint, but it's not to be forgotten as well. And as we start working with our driver and merchant partners and slowly shifting that ecosystem, then obviously our offsetting will reduce as well. So the idea is, as we get more and more efficient and we start really, really rapidly scaling these what I call business transformations, then the offsetting should and will also significantly reduce. But that said, there is a value to be put on it. I think there's a lot of questions and noise out there about what, this offset, this type of offsetting,
Right.
that type of offsetting, what is the right price for it, cap and trade system, and that's probably a whole other conversation, Tamor.
It is, and you used the phrase there, questions and noise, and I think that's probably a pretty fair summary of your future in this. There will be many questions and noise, but it's certainly an ambitious agenda, Tanah, and a really interesting conversation. And I wish you the best of luck in delivering on it and fielding the questions and noise, and look forward to keeping tabs on how you do. Thanks so much for talking to me.
Thanks, Tamor.